everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am a Director of Social Science Matrix at UC Berkeley. So for those of you who are new to Matrix, we are a cross-disciplinary social science research institute. And I am very pleased to welcome you to our panel today, titled America's Pursuit of Racial Justice. This event is actually the last this year in our Matrix On Point series, a series of panel discussions on important matters of the moment. So needless to say that we're ending the semester with a bang. We started conceiving of this particular panel in the wake of last summer's Black Lives Matter demonstrations. The fact that these protests represented by some measures the largest social movement in US history would have been reason enough to address it on its own terms, but it seemed equally urgent to take a longer historical perspective and place that movement in the broader context of the very long and unfinished struggle for racial justice and equality in the United States. So today's panel is a conversation about the past and about the present of that struggle. As I said, this is our last event of the academic year, so you can watch all of our past events on our website, which is, by the way, a new website. Because this is the last of the series, I want to take this opportunity to thank the Matrix team, which has done so much this year to run this program and make it exciting. So I want to thank Jessica Stewart, who helped plan actually today's event, Eva Cito, Chuck Kapelke, and Sarah Leigh. Now, let me introduce our distinguished moderator, Christopher Muller. So Chris Muller is Assistant Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley. He studies the political economy of incarceration in the United States from Reconstruction to the present, with a particular focus on how agricultural labor markets, migration, and struggles over land and labor have affected racial and class inequality in incarceration. He has also written on the causes and effects of environmental inequality and inequality in death from infectious disease. His work has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, the Annual Review of Sociology and Demography, among other venues. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Muller for an opening statement and for the panelist introduction. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Chris. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce our panelists today. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which we'll be hearing from them. Brandon M. Terry is Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies and Social Studies at Harvard University. He earned a PhD with university distinction in Political Science and African American Studies from Yale University, where he was also a Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellow and a recipient of the Sterling Prize. Professor Terry is the co-editor of a book on the political philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. and another one on King's political legacy. He is currently finishing an eagerly awaited manuscript titled The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement, which offers an analysis of the relationship between historiography and political theory through the lens of the African-American civil rights movement. Leigh Rayford is Associate Professor of African-American Studies at UC Berkeley, where she studies and teaches about race, gender, justice, and visuality. Professor Rayford also serves as inaugural director of the Black Studies Collaboratory, an initiative funded by a Mellon Foundation Just Futures grant. Professor Rayford is the author of Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, Photography and the African-American Freedom Struggle, co-editor of Migrating the Black Body, Visual Culture and the African Diaspora, and co-editor of The Civil Rights Movement in American Memory. She is currently working on a book entitled When Home is a Photograph, Blackness and Belonging in the World. Finally, Monica Bell is an associate professor of law and sociology at Yale Law School. Her research focuses on policing and the criminal legal system, welfare and public benefits law, housing law, and race in the law. Professor Bell's scholarship has appeared or is forthcoming in the Yale Law Journal, the American Journal of Sociology, and the NYU Law Review, among many other venues. Before joining the faculty at Yale, Professor Bell was a Klemenko Fellow and lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She has also served on the staff of the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia and multiple political campaigns. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend, Professor Terry.
Well, first, I just want to thank everybody who's organized this from UC Berkeley and the Matrix program. It's a real honor to be here with my dear friend Chris and Monica and Leigh. I'm just really looking forward to the conversation. I wanted to start by contextualizing my remarks in a kind of dialectic between the past and the present. So when Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, the metaphysics of money and the violence of race and class subjection collided in so spectacular a fashion that it's difficult not to dwell on the power of the former as a metaphor for the latter. Floyd's forged $20 bill under the exacting view of a cashier was found to be of no worth the state or citizenry was bound to respect. Floyd's life under an unyielding officer's knee and the thoughtless solidarity of the badge was subjected to the same accounting. It could not compel, in the eyes of his tormentors, the fair value of his supposed civic or human equality. When the state fails in this way, when it fails in an enduring and systematic fashion to protect the basic rights, dignity, and even bare lives of its ostensible citizens, it seems only right to speak of it as akin to money without value or currency without credit. If the supposed devotees to Martin Luther King Jr. in American politics were to treat his public philosophy and memory with less cynicism, they might recall that his famous address at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom began exactly with this incisive analogy. From the steps of the Lincoln Monument, King proclaimed that he and the roughly 250,000 people who gathered in the nation's capital that day had come to cash a check. This check, he argued, was the promissory note written in our founding documents that declares our government as justified and worth preserving only to the extent that it secures rather than destroys our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Surveying the vast human wreckage of racism and economic inequality at the twilight of Jim Crow, King declared that it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, King charged, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. So one of the central questions that the civil rights movement raised was whether the idea of egalitarian citizenship for ordinary African Americans in this society was a promissory note with real value, with a possible future of real fulfillment, or whether the basic structure of American society is organized such that these kinds of aspirations will always prove counterfeit or worthless in the last instance. In 1961, nearby at Harvard Law School, Malcolm X insisted that there is no such thing as a second-class citizen. We are full citizens or we are not citizens at all. But for Malcolm, at least as he put the point later in 1964, the writing was on the wall. It was, quote, as impossible for this system, this economic system, this political system, this social system, to produce freedom right now for the Black man in this country as it is for a chicken to produce a duck egg. King, by contrast, and his allies, offered a different wager. We refuse to believe, he proclaimed in 1963, that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt or that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity. This refusal of pessimism and fatalism is part of the animating spirit behind the civil rights movement and a crucial inspiration to its most heroic efforts. It's also what makes it a target of contemporary Afro-pessimists. Yet what is remarkable about the movement's greatest theorists like King or Bayard Rustin or Ella Baker is that they are all forcefully upfront about how difficult it will be to make the currency of citizenship real because of an intractable feature of political life that the American dilemma of racial oppression dramatizes, namely the non-sovereign character of political freedom and agency. So while the initiative and action of African Americans themselves are indispensable to the achievement of freedom and the enactment of agency, the efficacy of our agency and the quality of freedom we can achieve is always contingent on material circumstances, forms of uptake, and patterns of interpretation that require others. There's a perpetual temptation out of frustration, out of vulnerability, out of even bravado, to take this fact of non-sovereignty to license nihilism or resignation. There's also a temptation to ignore this fact in bad faith and imagine a world in which Black agency alone could achieve the kinds of fundamental transformations of political economy, constitutional law, and global governance that would really radically further or achieve the goods of freedom for the truly disadvantaged. This, of course, was King's critique of Black nationalism. He thought that too many in the Black Power movement shifted from a legitimate and necessary concern for group unity and Black identity, as he wrote, to the belief that there can be a separate Black road to power and fulfillment. Few ideas, he said, are more unrealistic. There is no salvation for the Negro through isolation. A truly just society of free and equal citizens, these activists argued, would require a greater degree of respectful co-creation and fair cooperation across the so-called color line at home and abroad than has ever been evidenced thus far in American society. So one way to think about the formative dilemmas or problems of the civil rights movement is to think about this dilemma of non-sovereign freedom as a central preoccupation. What modes of politics, movement thinkers and organizers asked, could elicit the kinds of affective, emotional responses, interpretive accounts, concrete actions, and acts of judgment from outside the movement that might make the egalitarian demands of the movement more efficacious and enduring across society? What forms of action in concert or self-interpretation could invite broader participation, broader solidarity, broader support, without, however, becoming self-undermining? And here, really importantly, when I invoke the idea of self-undermining forms of solidarity, I mean those alliances and actions that, as Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton warned in Black Power, that would represent an intolerable violation of our dignity and self-respect, or a mutilation of our psychological stability and flourishing. I mean those political alliances and actions that have the ironic consequence of reifying the racial stigmas, ideologies, and unjust disadvantages that they're ostensibly arrayed to destroy. So I think that recovering these questions, which animated much of the civil rights movement, is not just a problem of historical interest. Part of our problem with the inheritance of the civil rights movement is that its moral authority and cultural presence often leads people to treat various answers that civil rights luminaries offered to their questions as axiomatic for our debates in the present. We forget that although they aim to answer an enduring question of anti-racist politics, this question of non-sovereign freedom, they did so in a problem space that's not exactly ours. Reconstructing their political arguments as stemming from, in part, the recognition of the non-sovereign character of freedom, while also mapping out the conditions in which they had to produce answers, we can better illuminate the problems we face beyond the tired inherited binaries of race versus class, for or against respectability politics, nonviolence versus political violence, and internationalism versus civic nationalism. So I wanted to conclude my remarks, make the last half of my remarks about pitching three questions or problems that seem crucial to the present, but which get described in a way that I think misconstrues civil rights movement analogies and produces confusions in the present. So the first is the nonviolence-violence distinction. So there are lots of people who in the contemporary moment troubling, the reliable distinction that we tend to make between violence and nonviolence, including your colleague Judith Butler, who wrote a wonderful book on the power of nonviolence. And they're troubling this distinction partly on the grounds that civil rights protest elicited violence. More rarely noticed, but still important, is that civil rights protests actually bargained with veiled threats of violence, so that King often spoke in prophetic terms about what would be unleashed if nonviolent protests were not met with some kind of acquiescence or reconciliation. And civil rights nonviolent direct action also relied upon the flanking effect of unaffiliated violent actors. So Malcolm X often mocked civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham because he thought that the concessions made in Birmingham were not due to the disciplined action of civil rights protesters, but the insurgent violent rebellion of people below who were not affiliated with the movement. We often talk about Bloody Sunday and Selma as a heroic triumph of nonviolent direct action, but the nonviolent direct action protesters are arguably not massacred because of the violent self-defense enacted by the people who lived in the housing project on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who came out to defend them as they were being chased by the vigilantes and police. So I think all of this is true and important. It's important to trouble the reliable distinction between violent and nonviolent protest, and to draw attention to the ways that nonviolent protest can be weaponized as an ideal to delegitimize perfectly defensible forms of protest. But I want to make the point that it's wrong to overemphasize this point that the atmosphere of violence made nonviolence efficacious without appreciating that the obverse is likely just as true. So it seems that the existence of a nonviolent movement that can credibly deny participation in or unambiguous support of violent rebellion is the kind of movement that's best disposed to turn the existence of violence into progressive political gain. So I think there's been an overcorrection that doesn't really appreciate how you need a nonviolent movement that can reliably distinguish itself from sporadic acts of violence in order to channel victories into politics in an enduring sense. Relatedly, it's also a confusion, I think, to understand nonviolence as somehow axiomatically opposed to coercion. So King in particular was very forthright about the fact that his defense of nonviolence entailed a defense of coercion, but he thought that nonviolent coercion, in other words, coercion practiced in the spirit of love and civility that avoided forms of annihilation and humiliation, he thought this kind of coercion was more likely to produce an enduring peace, a practice of reconciliation and transitional justice. When you juxtaposed it or compared it to those forms of violent coercion, which he thought would produce resentment, retaliation, and distrust. So I say all that to say that the question I think should be at the center of debates about protests is not about violence or nonviolence in the abstract, which we battle it out with various civil rights analogies, but about recovering this problem of whether coercion is necessary in this protest movement and how coercion might be wielded in a way that produces the kinds of affective, cognitive, and political responses that we think are constitutive of an enduring and just democratic society. Now, the second problem I want to point to is internationalism. So one of the things that civil rights historians have done a really fantastic job of doing in the revisionist historiography has been to show how important the Cold War is. The Cold War gives the Black movement geopolitical power due to the ethical leverage and propaganda significance presupposed by the contest between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War era. Both countries are appealing to egalitarian values. Both are concerned with winning the allegiance of the so-called third world, the newly decolonizing nations, in part through soft power, at least in the early period. And this provides unprecedented leverage morally and politically for the civil rights struggle. And it's Vietnam that I think really collapses this geopolitics and moves people toward a more radical anti-imperialism and third world solidarity politics. But that politics, the politics that came to supplant the earlier politics of Black internationalism, never was able to produce the same degree of geopolitical leverage. Socialist revolutions that many in the Black Power movement hoped for just were not successful. And neither were they able to restructure the terrain of global governance, as Adom Getachew lays out in her wonderful book. So we often start, you'll hear people in the Black Lives Matter movement or academics that support it, they'll start from a presupposition of like the significance of internationalism. And they often talk about the global character of anti-Blackness or the ways in which the Palestinian cause can be really important, especially today, to Black activists. But bracketing the moral worth of these causes, which I think is extraordinary, and even bracketing the real instances of exchange and theory and organizing between groups like Palestinian activists in the Middle East and those at Ferguson, the geopolitics of the present seem far less favorable than the classic phase of the civil rights movement. We're not in Cold War containment politics that anchored the kind of leverage they were able to generate. We're not even in the kind of world of anti-slavery where anti-slavery activists could appeal to European publics and count on the high culture and moral authority of European judgment to sway American elites. Right now, there is no competing power with high valence in US policy circles that has a credibly egalitarian agenda on race. And there's no compelling or pressing geopolitical interest that's tightly tied to racial equality achievements or progress. So that gives us a lot to despair about in the realm of internationalism. But the rub and the tragedy is that equality for Blacks may require such dramatic economic transformations to international tax policy, corporate inversions, labor exploitation, that there needs to be some theorizing about how you can generate a new transnationalism that speaks to the contemporary problem space. I'm running out of time here, but I just want to conclude on one last point, which is about another question that I think is central to the debates, which is whether shared economic vulnerability and precarity can be a viable terrain upon which to build interracial solidarity. This was the big hope of King and Bayard Rustin. They thought automation would produce this, but their hope, which was nurtured in an age of post-war affluence and egalitarianism, didn't survive the neoliberal era of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think there's some evidence now that the kind of precarity produced by the neoliberal era, exacerbated by the pandemic and the opioid epidemic, has made a large number of millennials and Gen Zers break with conventional racist ideology. That their precarity may have produced a kind of skepticism toward the old narratives about Black pathology driving Black disadvantage. But if you look at the empirical data that has come out so far on participation in the protest and support for Black Lives Matter, what's stark about it is that once you look at older people, you see that support is really concentrated among whites, at least, among the most well-off and most highly educated. So the idea that there's a kind of shared interest born out of precarity, born out of economic vulnerability, seems not to be the fact of the matter at present. And then there becomes a question that the model of organizing, the model of interracialism that King and Bayard Rustin endorsed, does not seem to be the basis of solidarity that BLM is thriving upon in the present. So that raises two questions, which I'll end on. The first is whether that interracial solidarity, the mass participation of non-Blacks that you saw this summer, can be sustained as the issues in BLM move from things of discrete police violence to broader redistributive claims and restructuring of political economy. That's number one. Number two, and I think even more fascinating, is whether Black solidarity can be maintained as BLM turned from issues where many Black elites and Black middle class folks feel especially vulnerable, so things like police violence or racist terrorist violence, to questions of eviction or rent control or free community college and increased taxes, where many Black elites and Black middle class people may diverge in their interest from the truly disadvantaged, in William Julius Wilson's phrase. So there is a question about whether the kind of Black solidarity BLM relies upon is being papered over with a sense of shared vulnerability that itself may not really hold up to empirical evidence, and certainly falls apart as we turn to other material interest. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over back to the panel.
Okay, Professor Rayford.
Thank you, Chris, and Marion and Chuck and all of the Matrix team for organizing this event. It was I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with Brandon and Monica, and I look forward to really engaging Brandon's provocative and important questions. I'm joining you today from Berkeley, California, my home, and where I work, both of which are sited on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. I want to recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. And so I offer this as an acknowledgement and to pay respect to Ohlone ancestors, peoples today, and the Ohlone future to come. My comments today about the parallel and intertwined conversation about the history and future of Black life on stolen lands will focus on the questions of visuality and representation. In last summer's uprisings and in the longer Black freedom struggle. And indeed, I understand such land acknowledgements as an effort to name and make visible histories of dispossession, violence, and ongoing struggle that are often erased and are unseen, made to be unseen. In the movements of last summer, of course, visual images played an extraordinarily central role, from the hypercirculation of videos of police violence as catalysts for protest, battles to control narratives around images of protest and police repression, as well as a range of social movement media strategies to visualize Black futures. And I begin probably not as a social scientist, but from my training in Black studies, Black cultural studies, that the concept of representation is always at once political and cultural, that they cannot be separated, especially in the context of Black life and the lives of marginalized people. That is, representation in the formally political sense, in terms of who is represented in the polity, is always bound up with the concept of representation in the cultural sense, in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and the forms we use to tell those stories. Representation, especially around images and their circulation, constitutes the building of a shared community, a shared set of values, interests, language, culture, and representation thus works to build communities and also police the boundaries of community. And I think we sort of some of the provocation of Brandon's last question about the breadth or the ability of Black Lives Matter to hold, to kind of hold on to, hold a solidarity. But visuality is inextricable from Black movements' efforts to change the conditions of Black people's lives. Not least of that to be transformed is the individual and collective sense of one's power, efficacy, and being in the world. And by visuality, I'm referring here to how we see Blackness, the meanings we attach to Black people and Black bodies, and the value we attach to Black life because of this sight. Visuality broadly has been a way to underscore white supremacy, to underscore ideas about hierarchy, about imagined inherent biological racial differences. It's been a way to promote violence or promote, dehumanization or otherization. And we can go back in many ways to the founding of art history as a discipline. People like Johann Winkelmann, considered one of the sort of forefathers of art history, who in his position as librarian at the Vatican in the 18th century started looking at Greek and Roman statues and developed ideas about ideal beauty based on these statuary. And specifically for Winkelmann, it was his love for the Apollo of Belvedere. And Winkelmann's many students from there developed a linking of science and art, and the categorization of human bodies, of human skulls that are imagined to hold truths that could then be visualized. These drawings of human skulls, the beautiful slope of the Caucasian skull, right? Like, so literally the skull from the Caucasus region, which is where the way Caucasian comes to stand in for white. So there is a longer history of the visual as undergirding and proving racial difference and hierarchy in this way. And so there are already, some images of the first encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples in Africa and the Americas that have reinstantiated myths about racial cultural difference and hierarchy. And with the advent of photography, particularly this imagined way of apprehending true nature in its purest form, photography quickly emerges as a tool to visualize racial difference. And so too, we get with photography the sort of abolitionist images that start to circulate of survivors of slavery and the kinds of violences that they'd endured. So we can think, for example, of the famous image of an enslaved man named Gordon and his whip-scarred back that became an abolitionist tool. Now, of course, Black people, whether part of formal social movements or not, have understood the power of visual representation. Frederick Douglass understood this intimately and keenly. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, like most photographed American of any race or gender of the 19th century. And Douglass wrote extensively about photography. In his 1861 speech, Pictures in Progress, Douglass starts off, begins with a conversation about representation, the so-called, and the birth of photography, and then ends with the question of abolition and democracy, understanding these concepts as ultimately bound to one another. For Douglass, the right to represent oneself is important, of course, but it is more than that. It is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. So for Douglass and others, creating images of themselves in the 19th century came to image something that looks like self-possession, that is a version of perhaps the non-sovereign freedom that Brandon was talking about. So across the longer arc of my research, I have examined photography as part of Black social movement strategy. My work begins with images of lynchings employed in anti-lynching movements. I've studied the training of photographers and the cultivation of distinct visual aesthetics in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in the Black Panther Party, and other organizations of the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power era. And across this arc, images of Black death, the murder of Black men, women, and children have functioned as both a visual trauma and a touchstone for movements. Images of lynching specifically emerge after the end of slavery as a mode of terror and control, primarily in the U.S. South. But of course, we know that lynchings were recorded in every state in the Union. Lynching itself as a form of violence emerged after the Civil War and coincided with the invention of the Kodak camera, which allowed for amateur photography to emerge. And so these kind of the circulation of images of lynching was made possible by this moment of emergence of modern technology. And I think we have to understand the confluence around lynching photographs as achieving a number of different aims toward the perpetuation of white supremacy. Photographs emerge as a kind of cultural manifestation and extension of the practices of the rebuilding of racial apartheid in the South after the forceful end of Reconstruction. One could still access the terror or sense of control embodied by a lynching through the possession of a lynching photograph. And we know as well that many lynching photographs were made into postcards and circulated through the US mail up until about 1909, when the US Postal Service banned the sending of incendiary material through the mail. Beginning with Ida B. Wells in 1895, followed by the NAACP, Black social movements began using these photographs, recontextualizing them, reframing their narrative to demonstrate, to prove the barbarity of white supremacy. And the strategy relied on a faith in the photographic image, relied in a kind of currency of truth purported or that we've invested in the photographic image. I think what has changed in our current moment and in what we saw in last summer's movement is that on one hand, videos and images of Black death comprise an accumulated visual record that makes it hard to deny the sheer number of acts of violence, of state-sanctioned murder through these videos. And that accumulation of evidence in many ways is important, especially for non-Black people or for people who have not been necessarily immediately impacted or affected by such violence, and to have a notion or to reckon with the reality of that violence. And that's been one effect. However, one of the effects on Black people in particular, though, is that the circulation of these images has also meant increased levels of stress and trauma. Writer Teju Cole has called it death in the browser tab, the easy accessibility of these images. So if you're watching YouTube and there's autoplay, for example, you have no control over the next video. Or if you're scrolling through your Instagram or your Twitter feed and it shows up, right, without a sense of choice. And that proliferation and accessibility in a way that we don't actually have control over when they come, how we receive them, has, I think, changed the kind of landscape of the role of these videos. They bring people to the streets on one hand, right? But there's also there's a toll, a cost to their circulation. And this is, I think something that movements have been wrestling with in our contemporary moment, and maybe even more so since the circulation of the Rodney King video. On the one hand, right, we saw it very clearly as acts of police brutality, but again, to invoke Judith Butler again, as she's written, so incisively, that video became disaggregated and recontextualized and reframed in the courtroom and used as evidence of King's dangerousness, that he refused to stay down, etc., and to reframe him as King as the aggressor. I think what's been really important and noteworthy in our contemporary social movements is organizers not using images of police violence as part of the framing of their movements, but focusing instead on more celebratory images of joy and struggle, or joy in struggle, as well as a kind of reframing and recentering of white and police participants. So, for example, in the movement for Black Lives, is chosen in much of their visual material, have chosen not to explicitly circulate images of murder, but we know they exist, and we know what they look like, and we also know the kinds of trauma and distress that they cause Black folks in particular to see them. So we don't need to actually post them, right? The sense that it is not on us to prove that these things have happened. And I think this also speaks to a kind of rejection as well of facile notions of representation. I think we're in a moment of a heightened manifestation of what Stuart Hall called the politics of representation, rather than a struggle over the relations of representation, right? That it's not merely to have, that visibility itself is not necessarily the strategy to counter invisibility, but it can be its own set of traps and confines. I think also we can think about this in terms of visual strategies for certain kinds of containment or incorporation of social movements. So if we think, for example, of Black Lives Matter painted on city streets, which my colleague Brandy Summers has written so forcefully about. On one hand, these letters form an assertion of power and presence in public, as Paul Farber of Monument Lab has written. But it begs the question, for whom, right? It's a sign that literally loses its legibility the closer you are to the ground, right? But it is most effectively seen from above. And so always the question of how attached to real reform or real transformation and real justice does this work do? So instead, I think we're seeing a moment where images are working to capture the energy of the sociality of struggle, not decentering Black actors or Black people in the movement, yet while placing focus on structures and as well as highlighting police and other participants. All to say, these are images that are making Black livingness the focal point and work to imagine the world to come. And so where I want to end is just to think about the ways in which I think it's no accident that last summer's racial reckoning also articulated the movement for Black lives with a movement to topple monuments, both nationally and abroad. These are twin struggles to intervene in the representations of our past and how we imagine and enact our collective future. And with that, I will end my comments, and I look forward to conversation.
Thank you, Professor Rayford. Before handing it over to Professor, if you'd like to put your questions in the Q&A, we'll be taking them after Professor Bell has finished her presentation. So Professor Bell, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I want to thank all the organizers and my co-panelists for being a part of this event. I also, following Leigh, want to acknowledge the land that I am on. I'm in New Haven, Connecticut, which is historically the land of the Quinnipiac, but I also think it's important to note more recent occupations of New Haven by Yale, and particularly the Black community here in this kind of triple occupation by multiple police forces, including the Yale Police Department, which is the oldest police department in the nation. And right now there's a lot of activism going on our campus, on multiple campuses, around notions of abolishing the campus police department. And I think there's a lot, part of what I'm going to talk about, I think, is related to that broader sort of conversation. So what I want to do in this talk is to talk about Black Lives Matter in sort of three phases, essentially the Obama era, the Trump era, and the Biden era today, over the past few months, as a way of thinking about, as a way of sort of engaging a lot of the questions that Brandon and Leigh raised in their talks. So I'll start with Obama era Black Lives Matter. So if we step back and remember what Black Lives Matter kind of articulated at the very beginning, the expression was really one, and very much picks up on what Leigh was talking about, one of kind of radical visibility. It's like Black people are here and Black Lives Matter. But the policy prescription aspect of this was really secondary. And so just to kind of put a finer point on this, I thought I'd read a quick excerpt from Claudia Rankine's amazing essay in the New York Times in 2015, which is important, which is the condition of Black life is one of mourning. So Rankine writes, as part of a longer essay, the Black Lives Matter movement can be read as an attempt to keep mourning an open dynamic in our culture because Black lives exist in a state of precariousness. Mourning then bears both the vulnerability inherent in Black lives and the instability regarding a future for those lives. Unlike earlier Black power movements that tried to fight or segregate for self-preservation, Black Lives Matter aligns with the dead, continues the mourning, and refuses the forgetting in front of all of us. If the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement made demands that altered the course of American lives and backed up those demands with the willingness to give up your life in service of your civil rights, with Black Lives Matter, a more internalized change is being asked for, recognition. So I think Rankine's essay does a really good job of kind of summarizing the essential claims of the first phase of the Black Lives Matter movement during the Obama era. And so in many ways, this demand for recognition, more so than a demand for particular policy prescriptions or political arguments, was very much in keeping with other movements that had preceded Black Lives Matter. So I'm thinking here in particular about Occupy Wall Street, where part of the conceit of the movement was to say, we are leaderless and we are not going to lay out a particular set of policy demands. The point of the movement in some ways is the movement. It's about a particular sort of prescription of problems. We also see this, and so we see this in particular, and one of the core demands of the Obama era kind of engagement in protest around police violence. So with focus on Eric Garner's articulation about not being able to breathe, I can't breathe, and also stop killing us. Like these were the nature of the demands. They weren't about law. So if you want to read more about really that era of Black Lives Matter, Amna Akbar has a great article in the NYU Law Review called Toward a Radical Imagination of Law that tackles the idea that the nature of legal demands of the Obama era Black Lives Matter movement in particular was to rethink the centrality of law. So in fact, there is not a space for lawyers at the front of the movement today. Instead, to the extent lawyers are involved, it's in a sort of supportive role, and the main mission is to really demand recognition of Black life. So that's all fine and well, and really, I mean, you might even think of it as a kind of a phenomenological type of aim, where the focus is to amplify the experience of Black people, but in much as the way that Leigh articulated, not so much to use, images of death or in this sort of negative way, but instead to imagine or to kind of set out a vision of Black life and recognition of Black life that is robust and complex. So that's all fine and well. However, there were some problems, I think. I mean, I'll go ahead and call them problems, even though that might be a controversial way of putting it. There are some problems with that type of advocacy during the Obama era for particularly the more radical wing of the Black Lives Matter movement. Because policy prescription of, whatever you want to call it, I'm referring broadly to policy prescription, because policy prescription was not at the heart of advocacy in that first era, Obama era, Black Lives Matter, much policy prescription from outside the movement stepped in to fill that vacuum. And this is something that I've written about in a 2017 essay called Police Reform and the Dismantling of Legal Estrangement in the Yale Law Journal. One of the interesting kind of moments, and probably I think one of the seminal documents that one would look to identify what I just articulated, about the how policymakers stepped in to fill the vacuum, was a 2015 White House task force report on police reform, which centered the debate about police reform largely in a goal toward building trust or legitimacy of police. And importantly, there were activists in that room. There were Black Lives Matter activists in the room being part of the task force and coming out with prescriptions among many other prescriptions that oriented themselves around training police officers to be better, a better education for police officers. Nothing about shifting broader dynamics such that police are less central or even kind of non-existent as a central force in marginalized communities of color. That wasn't a key part of the conversation. And one can of course imagine that a White House report might not say something like that. But what's key is that conversations around body cameras and like all of these, there were lots of reforms being proposed and not really a clear picture of what the radical activist positionality would be around those things, at least not one that was central to the discourse. And so one of the things that is really important to highlight here is this move between the Obama era Black Lives Matter and the Trump era Black Lives Matter. Now I'm being, kind of crass and I'll just say sociological in some ways and analytical by dividing them in this way. Of course, there's a continuum. But if we think about, I'm speaking very broadly about Black Lives Matter from 2016 to today, or to just before today during the Trump era. This changes a lot. So this movement away from being prescriptive about what needs to happen changes. That changes in part because of local organizing throughout this entire era, in which people started to have more conversations about what imagining a new kind of world would look like, and therefore thinking much harder about policy. Now, of course, I want to clarify that I'm speaking in broad terms. Of course, there were organizations making an array of policy prescriptions before 2016. But the question is, how central is policy prescription to the work? So I think a seminal moment, really in summer of 2020, that captures what I mean by the shift between Obama and Trump era BLM, is the debate over 8 Can't Wait and 8 to Abolition. So Campaign Zero, which was one of the front-facing kind of central organizations led by DeRay McKesson during the Obama era Black Lives Matter advocacy, joined a coalition of organizations to release a list of policies, police reforms called 8 Can't Wait, that focused on, kind of the standard sorts of reforms that people on the liberal side of the equation tend to advocate for. And swiftly, in response to this list of 8 policy prescriptions that were broadly acceptable to liberals, a group of activists released 8 to Abolition, which is, a much more capacious set of 8 things that decenter internal police reforms and instead kind of situate policing in a broader agenda of social transformation, which harkens to what Professor Terry or what Brandon was talking about toward the end of his talk. So this debate, like, is it 8 can't wait? Are we doing internal police reforms that seem to be programmatic and may be able to kind of get national legislation around them? Or are we focusing on 8 to, kind of these kind of abolitionist sorts of reforms? Became a key aspect of the movement. So, and of course, the sort of elephant in the room here when talking about the summer of 2020, and I'm kind of fast forwarding, is defund the police, which emerged out of local organizing in a similar way that I described around abolition that was occurring in this kind of move between the Obama era and the Trump era in Black Lives Matter. So what's important there is that the claims of Black Lives Matter activists and racial justice activists more broadly, alongside moves like the 1619 Project and all these sorts of broader conversational changes, is to examine the ways in which racism in America is not just structural, but also fundamental, is a basic part of the project, and therefore is also a basic part of the project of policing. And so what we see in racial justice advocacy around policing now is a move toward demands not just for stopping killing us, but instead for liberation. And so this last point gets to a bit of the conversation in the new Biden era. And I want to engage here with some of the questions that Brandon invited us to think about. And I'm happy, I wanted to say more about divest in this, but I think I'll save that in case anyone wants to talk about that during Q&A. But so, there's a question now of what is the movement going to do now with Biden and the emerging sort of deep heterogeneity in the Black community that is kind of coming to the surface in demands over defunding and demands over abolition, but also in demands that are kind of surrounding police reform sorts of claims. So we see this clearly demonstrated in the debate over the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, where there is legislation that has been voted out of the House, is unlikely, I think, to pass the Senate, but I guess we'll see. But all of the reform, or many of the reforms in the act, kind of tick those boxes of policy prescriptions that were offered in 2014 and 2015, right? So more funding for body cameras is in there. There are also some changes that could be quite helpful, like data being more available. But there's also the hot debate over qualified immunity, which I don't quite understand why that's the sticking point. But happy to talk about that more in Q&A as well. But we also see this. So basically, there is legislation on the table that is likely that could reduce instances of police violence and therefore make a real tangible difference in some Black people's lives, but it is unclear because of the kind of political energy surrounding more radical demands like defunding and abolition, whether like how to think about the George Floyd Act in light of that. The second quick point, I know now that I'm out of time, but I just wanted to say something about the Chauvin verdict, which puts a finer point on what I just said. So In abolitionist and activist circles, after the Chauvin verdict, there was a lot of reminders. Chauvin being convicted is not an abolitionist form of accountability, and this is not something for us to celebrate. At the same time, many Black people were relieved that Chauvin was convicted of murder, and so and there's a way in which certain types of activist claims are out of sync with what many Black people kind of feel if they're not kind of radicalized and organized. And this, I think, is a real challenge going forward for movements. And that's also historically been the case. But it does present a number of interesting questions about how the movement will continue to maintain its legitimacy as representing this demand for recognition of Black Lives Mattering as the specific policy prescriptions that have now been introduced in the Trump and Biden era become ever more detached from kind of like if you took polls of Black people, what they would demand. So I'm going to stop there, and I apologize for going over time.
Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone. These were, incredible comments. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And again, this is a reminder to the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A and I can relay them from there. Maybe working backwards, just to think about each of these presentations, on this question that you just put to us, Monica, I'd love to hear your thoughts. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the idea of abolition democracy. And it seems that a lot of what you're pointing to are the challenges of the democratic side of abolition. How do we think about abolition alongside a definition of democracy that we would call rule by the people, which I think raises its own sorts of questions and political problems. I thought we could also sort of put to the entire panel, maybe everybody could react to, I think, these key disjunctures, imperfect analogies, I guess, between the civil rights movement and the uprisings of last year. In Leigh's case, sort of disjunctures around images, the use of images, and the ways that they were used in the civil rights movement, and the ways that they're being used by Black Lives Matter and other groups. And then I thought, the key disjunctures, I'd love to hear what Monica and Leigh have to say about these key disjunctures that Brandon raised, the different international context, sort of problems of class and how that's changed over time, and then debates about the role of violence versus nonviolence and the kind of dialectical relationship that Brandon proposed between them. So I'm not sure who would like to start with those questions, but I'd love to hear any reflections you might have about those.
Actually, I thought, all the presentations were extremely smart and raised really tough questions. And what I like about the conversation is that we're really trying to think the present. So I think we're all tentative where it seems appropriate to be tentative. But one thing I was struck by in Leigh's presentation was this question about the images. And I wanted to add two things to it that I think are I hope, helpful. So one is, there's this fascinating thing that I've noticed. I've written a little bit about this in some of my King essays, but if you read King, what's really, really remarkable about his rhetoric at the time is that he's constantly arguing that the thing everyone thinks about Black people is that we're too passive, that we'll just endure any kind of abuse, any kind of injustice without standing up for ourselves. And that's the central foundation of racist ideology that we have to dismantle. So when you think about the civil rights movement as an aesthetic question, part of what the force is, at least according to King and some of the participants, is that you see Black people breaking the stereotype of passivity, showing remarkable discipline, transgressing people's expectations of what their political life worlds are oriented around. What's hard about our aesthetic moment is that we live under the exact opposite stereotype. That now the stereotype of Black people is that we're so aggrieved, we're so quick to protest at the slightest insult, that this is what we do, right? We are the protesting group. And you see it in all of the public opinion data. When you ask whites, it's like, well, what kind of responses should people have to racial injustice? What do you think would be effective? Whites overwhelmingly say, more than any other group, they're like, not any more protests. And it's in part because of an aesthetic, it's tied up in politics, but it's partly an aesthetic thing where part of the problem of Black Lives Matter is like, how do you produce an aesthetic spectacle around protests or an aesthetic charge around protests that doesn't feel already mediated by type, that doesn't feel like civil rights reenactment? And I think people have been really remarkably creative around that. But to me, that just seems like a really incisive area for cultural studies, for critical theory, for political theory to take seriously. That's number one. Number 2 point, and I'll be much briefer here, is that this death by browser tab point and the traumatic impact of these videos, I think is a really crucial question. And my colleague, David Williams, a great public health scholar, the most cited Black person in all of the social sciences, has just come out with another paper on this problem, really trying to document the actual effects of this. The only thing I would add, however, is that even prior to these videos, the phenomenon of the cell phone, the phenomenon of the exchanging of videos online actually predates this in an interesting way, which is the sharing of videos around community violence. So there really is a class stratified feature of Black life that I think people don't pay enough attention to, which is that many Black people, particularly young Black people, get a lot of their interaction from sites like World Star Hip Hop, flyhype.com, places like that, where videos of community violence circulate constantly. Full murders. Now, and if you follow the Chicago drill scene or the Brooklyn drill scene, hip hop, they make songs about people's murders, referencing people by name who've been killed, showing their pictures, showing the videos from crime scenes. And so I am only adding that the dialectical relationship between community violence and police violence is actually mirrored online in a really horrific way, that people's online lives are pretty saturated with these videos of Black victimization. And it's not really clear what the long-term traumatic effects of that are or going to be.
Thank you for that, Brandon. That was just really exciting to think alongside. I think a couple of things. When you're talking about sort of the transformation or the transition between the certain kinds of perceptions of the stereotypes, right, that surround Black people in the public arena or in the visual realm, whether it's passive, overly passive, or overly quick to protest. I think both of what they both speak to, it's not an opposite. They're actually the opposite sides of the same coin of flattening of Black life, right, and Black possibility, right. And it's I think there was a panel we did a few weeks ago, and and some of the panelists were talking about right, I don't want to be protesting. I just want to look at butterflies with my kids, right? And I think that's actually part of what I think the aesthetic has to be, right, is creating that space for visualizing what outside of the kind of political ontology of what we imagine black people or Black life to be, right? And that's, in a sense, that might actually be the hinge that the place where the opening, right, for an aesthetic that opens, that holds a movement together, that is not, we are not only protest, we are not only fodder for violence, right? But we how do we actually create an aesthetic of quiet, right? And I think, some of the images that I was trying to describe from last summer sort of counter are, and however you want to take it, right? Like Black joy also becomes a kind of weapon, right? It becomes weaponized in this moment. But I think this is also the effort where I think we're also seeing sort of twinned with movements to move away from reform towards defunding and towards abolition is actually a movement of the imaginary, right? In so many ways, because I think what Monica described so powerfully, right, is that reform is just literally like, we have it, this is what we have, let's just strengthen the structure a little bit. But then how do you literally visualize something that we don't know, right? And I think actually, and so that was sort of one question, and I think you're right, we don't know the long-term effects of these images, but I think for me, why I always return to lynching photography is that, so it's because it is a longer, that the technology changes, right? But in so many ways, right, the fact of Black death, right, the condition of mourning that Monica described, Rankin describing, right, is a kind of consistent, right? I think that there is something about a level of control around like where the violence comes from and how it's being circulated, that I would love to kind of hear more about, in terms of like between World Star and CNN, right? So I think those are all really interesting provocations. I actually I sort of missed Chris's second question because I was thinking about abolition democracy, and I was thinking about Du Bois, exactly that question of how democracy becomes the kind of it's a very complex project. And I think for in my reading of Du Bois, that the place where abolition democracy becomes, I don't want to say an impossibility, but a really tough hill to climb is where it hits racial capitalism, right? And that a democracy that is beholden to a kind of to capitalism, and to a capitalism based on slavery and dispossession, is what makes a kind of abolition, and also what makes democracy itself a kind of fraught project. And I would love to hear, I would love to hear you all as political scientists and legal scholars say a little bit more about that.
I'll jump in. So this conversation is so fascinating, and I'm gonna, I just thought I would mention when Brandon was talking about World Star Hip Hop, etc. I thought about Forrest Stewart's book, Ballad of the Bullet, out pretty recently, that I think is helpful for thinking about like the relationship between these kind of representations and like any actual violence. And I also was thinking about Erica Hart actually when in the conversation about Black joy, and one of the things that Erica Hart did on her Instagram in February was to kind of post photos of Black people doing just like living everyday life, having pleasant experiences as a way to kind of live out, I think, this demand and need, and kind of a broader sort of cultural change we could experience around understanding what it means for what Black life is, in order to think about how it matters. To engage these questions about abolition, democracy, and to circle around with the disjunctures that Brandon raised, that Chris asked us to talk about. So one of the things that is hard, one of the many things that is hard about abolition democracy, and seeing that term as not being oxymoronic, is that democracy can't just mean majoritarian rule based on information of today. Like, abolition democracy is an educational project. It's an ideological project. It's an organizing project. And so in my mind's eye, I think part of what the term abolition democracy has to mean is like redefining what democracy is at its very core. And I think that's what Du Bois, and that's what people like Angela Davis, et cetera, are kind of, and so that this idea that Leigh was inviting us to think about of imagination is like, so the temporality, I think, of an abolitionist perspective is unusual in a world where people are concerned about how do we get policies fast right now? How do we, get good results that we can, policies we can evaluate in the next 5 years? I mean, this is not the time horizon on which we engage in abolition democracy. So that's one thought. Quickly on some of the disjunctures. I think maybe the one I most want to talk about is class. So I'm going to do that one because of time. But I also want to talk about the violence in the national context. But class, I think, is a question, because I actually wonder whether class is the big disjuncture between, like as the demands of Black Lives Matter change toward focusing on like eviction and all of these things. I wonder whether class is the biggest issue as opposed to cohort. I really think there's a serious generational divide in terms of thinking about what politics should look like at all. That we saw lived out in the Biden versus Bernie kind of debates at a presidential politics level that has been consequential for thinking about Black Lives Matter in the age of Biden, because the fact that there is a Biden presidency, largely because of Black people in my home state of South Carolina, is a very particular, and especially older Black people, as I think is an understanding of class that's important. And I guess, there's also, well, I'm gonna stop there just to say that the class debate is actually quite complicated.
Yeah, I think this is all really powerful, and the abolition democracy question, I must say, I know that the big revival is Black Reconstruction. I'm always partial to Darkwater, for various reasons that we could discuss in some other panel. But what Du Bois does in Darkwater, which I think he does really clearly, is he brings up a question of economic democracy very straightforwardly. So if the question is about self-determination, if the question is about having the decisions by which people's life courses are determined, made by them in concert, if that's going to happen, it can't happen with the whole economic sphere cordoned off from democracy. It just cannot work that way. Like, so much of what we're compelled to do, so much of what the course of our lives is determined by, are the decisions made by the owners of capital. And Du Bois just straightforwardly says there that cannot be made to stand. Now, he also raised the question because he's Du Bois. He's just so great at being honest about what that means beyond rhetoric. He says, well, you can't have a bunch of people who don't know anything about the world or economics, then trying to make these decisions. People have to be educated. It goes to Monica's point. It's like there has to be a profound commitment to education. So I say all that just to say economics, yes, but a really underappreciated story of how we got to where we are right now with this level of polarization, with this threat of authoritarianism, with the cruelty that's being celebrated at the highest echelons of government, is the absolute destruction of education in this country. The hollowing out of what people know about the country they live in, and that is just a forthright, explicit policy goal of one party. That sets us up for a world in which there is no abolition democracy that's possible. Right? When people don't know the basic fundamentals about why this country went to civil war, what it means to have a mob of white reactionaries seize the Capitol, something that didn't even happen during the Civil War. If they don't understand that context, they're not going to be able to make good judgments, good decisions. So to me, that's a really crucial feature of the question here. Following up on Monica's point about class, in my remarks, I think you're totally right. So I think generationally, the class divides start to change dramatically. So our generation, millennials and younger, it looks far more progressive, particularly on issues of race, and it may represent a sea change and what America looks like going forward. I'm still skeptical for two reasons about the way that class will play a role. So one is a question of what the backlash to this moment looks like for Gen Z and what follows, and how people will frame their interest around a new racial formation that allows them to express their class interest without the kind of baldly anti-Black sentiment that characterized class politics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then secondly, is that I think what you're saying is true at the national level, but let me give you one counter example, which is like the Maryland gubernatorial election, an obscure election, but Benjamin Jealous runs, who's the head of the NAACP, obviously somebody who would be relatively supportive of Black Lives Matter. He's running in a state, Maryland, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, 30 to 40% Black. I forget exactly the number, but it's like 30% Black. You would think easily the best position plays for a Black progressive to win an election. And he gets destroyed by the Republican governor over claims that he's a socialist. And he loses, he has low support among Blacks, low support among liberals, because out of the heat of national politics, there are all of these Black middle class people, Maryland, it's the Karen Lacey book, Blue Chip Black. It's like there are a lot of Black people in Maryland who they were thinking, not my residential property taxes. And so I worry when we, that we're riding a high wave of, we're focused on the issue where Black middle class feel the most vulnerable. They've lived in a world where Black middle class victimization rates are lower than they have been in a really long time. To the extent that world stops existing, where we start pressing more demands, abolitionist demands, radical left demands, where criminal victimization goes up in part because of police politics, and we can discuss that. What happens to the Black middle class support for these movements? I just watched the Dave Chappelle podcast the other day, and he has this whole thing about like, well, I would like to pay taxes. I would support my taxes if I felt like they went to something good. And it's like, here's one of the most thoughtful commentators on race in America, but he can't even wrap his head around this question of what the tax support means, right? And you can see how that kind of rhetoric gets taken up very quickly to demonize a whole wide range. Not saying that that's his politics, but to demonize a whole wide range of social investments. So I am really worried about the class question. And I think it's something that's papered over with the most extreme rhetoric of shared vulnerability.
I feel like this conversation is just getting rolling, and yet I think we hit time. Is that correct, Marianne?
Yes, that is correct. Unfortunately, I am so enjoying this, but yes, it is time.
Okay, well, I just want to, extend just sincere thanks to our three extraordinary panelists for an absolutely brilliant conversation that we'll have to do another one sometime soon. But it's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.